The wind, a mournful whisper across the parched flats, carries the scent of dust and desperation. Elias Thorne, a man shaped by loss and the unyielding Dakota sun, squints towards the ramshackle cabin huddled at the very edge of Hardwater Creek, a place most folks pretended didn't exist. He needs help, a miracle even, and the woman living there, Alara Vance, is his last, thinnest thread of hope. They say she's cursed, a harbinger of ill fortune, a blight on any ground she walks. Every soul in Redemption Gulch, the nearby town that lived more by judgment than its name, would rather face ruin than invite her shadow across their threshold. But Elias's ranch, the legacy of his late wife Martha, is already tasting ruin, and his own shadow is growing long with despair. Before we ride deeper into this western tale, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments, and if you love a good old-fashioned story of the frontier, hit like and subscribe. The cabin door, barely clinging to its leather hinges, is a testament to neglect, much like the woman herself in the eyes of the community. Elias halts his tired gelding a respectful distance away, the creak of saddle leather loud in the oppressive quiet. He's rehearsed this, what to say, how to offer work to a woman everyone believed consorted with bad luck itself. Yet, standing there, with the wind tugging at his worn hat, the words felt hollow, insufficient for the weight of his need and the depth of her ostracization. He knows the stories. Crops failing where she merely passed, livestock sickening, wells drying up. He also knows his own well is nearly dry, his cattle are lean, and the banknote looms larger than the thunderheads that refuse to gather. And with a deep breath that tasted of grit and resolve, he swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the loose soil, each step a defiance of common sense and common superstition. Elias Thorne's world had shrunk to the boundaries of his Bar M ranch, a sprawling tract of land that once pulsed with life and laughter when Martha was alive. Now, it echoed with her absence. The fields, once rippling green, were mostly cracked earth, thirsting for rain that seemed to favor every other spread but his. His small herd of cattle, ribs showing like washboards, grazed listlessly on what sparse, sun-baked grass remained. Grief had been a poor foreman, and the seasons since Martha's passing had been relentlessly cruel. Dust storms choked the air, a late frost had nipped the early garden, and the creek, their lifeblood, had dwindled to a muddy trickle. He worked from before dawn till long after dusk, the labor a penance and a prayer, but one man's sweat couldn't turn the tide against such odds, not when his spirit felt as barren as his land. The solitude was a heavy cloak, its folds filled with memories and the quiet, gnawing fear of failure. Failure to Martha's memory, failure to the land itself. His moral code, ingrained by a stern but fair father, was simple. Work hard, be honest, and help those in need if you could. Right now, he was the one in need. Alara Vance knew only the fringes of any community. For years, her life had been a series of moves, each one prompted by the whispers that inevitably grew into shouts, the sideways glances that sharpened into open hostility. The curse, as they called it, had attached itself to her like a stubborn burr after a string of unfortunate coincidences in her youth. A sudden sickness in a neighbor's flock shortly after she'd admired them. A flash flood that wiped out a newly planted field she'd helped seed. It didn't matter that other, logical explanations existed. Fear and superstition had a stronger hold. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of its approach, the way conversations hushed when she drew near, the small offerings left at her door that were more ward than welcome, the way children were hurried indoors. Her current dwelling, this forgotten lean-to by Hardwater Creek, was just the latest in a long line of solitary outposts. She'd become adept at existing on little, her skills honed by necessity, foraging, mending, making do. There was a quiet strength in her, born of enduring, but also a deep weariness, a resignation that settled in the depths of her gray eyes. Their first trip into Redemption Gulch together for supplies was a stark reminder of her place. Elias, grim-faced, had insisted she accompany him, a silent declaration that she was now under his employ, his protection. As they walked down the dusty main street towards Miller's Mercantile, conversations stuttered and died. Windows seemed to gain more avid watchers. Mrs. Henderson, the portly wife of the town's self-important banker, Jedediah Henderson, sniffed loudly as they passed, her nose wrinkling as if Alara carried a physical contagion. "Some folks just don't have the sense God gave a goose," she'd muttered, loud enough for Elias to hear, her gaze like a pinprick on Ilara's back. Elias's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, merely steered Ilara towards the store with a firm hand on her elbow, a gesture that felt more like bracing against a storm than guidance. Inside Miller's, the usual jovial chatter was replaced by a strained silence. Old Man Miller, usually quick with a story or a piece of penny candy for children, served them with curt efficiency, his eyes avoiding Ilara's altogether. The air was thick with judgment, a palpable force that Ilara had learned to breathe, but Elias felt it like a fresh insult, a condemnation of his desperation. The cabin on the Bar M was sparse, but to Ilara, after the crumbling lean-to, it felt almost like a haven. It was Martha's old sewing room, small and tucked away at the back of the main ranch house, with a narrow cot, a washstand, and a small window that looked out onto the struggling vegetable garden. Elias had cleared it out himself, a layer of dust attesting to its long disuse. He'd been awkward, almost gruff, in showing it to her. "It ain't much," he'd mumbled, avoiding her gaze, "but it's dry. Meals are with me. Work starts at sunup." Their first days were a study in silent cohabitation. Ilara moved with a quiet efficiency that surprised Elias. She asked for little, observed much. The first test, or what Elias privately thought of as the curse's opening salvo, came on the second morning. He'd handed her a rusted hoe, its handle loose, to tackle the weed-choked patch Martha had once tended with such care. No sooner had she taken it than the head wobbled precariously and then clattered to the ground. Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen Jedediah Henderson watching from the road earlier, a smirk on his face. This was it, he thought, the start of the bad luck. But Ilara merely picked up the hoe head, examined the splintered wood of the handle, then walked to the small scrap pile behind the barn. With a few deft movements, using a piece of discarded wire and a strip of leather she'd salvaged from somewhere, she resecured the head, tighter than it had been in years. She tested it with a few sharp chops into the hard earth, then turned to the weeds, her movements economical and steady. Elias watched, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He'd expected, well, he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Catastrophe, perhaps, not quiet competence. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and turned back to mending a broken fence line, the image of her steady hands lingering in his mind. The incident, small as it was a seed. He'd chosen her out of desperation, a last gamble. Now, he found himself watching, waiting, not just for disaster, but for something else he couldn't yet name. Ilara settled into the rhythm of the ranch, a silent, observant presence. She tackled her chores with a diligence that belied the whispers surrounding her. She had an uncanny way with the animals. The old milk cow, Bess, who'd grown skittish and mean-tempered since Martha's passing, allowed Alara to approach and milk her without a single kick, her lowing soft and contented. Elias, watching from the barn door, felt a pang. Martha had had that touch too. He'd found Alara one afternoon sitting quietly in the dusty corral, talking in low murmurs to his gelding Diablo, who had a festering sore on his leg that refused to heal. Diablo, usually impatient and head-shy, stood stock still, his ears pricked forward, as Alara gently cleaned the wound with a poultice of crushed leaves she'd gathered from the creek bank. "What's that you're using?" Elias had asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Alara didn't startle. "Yarrow and plantain," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horse's leg. "Good for drawing out infection and mending skin." He'd never heard of such things. The vet from Miles City had prescribed a harsh carbolic wash that seemed to irritate more than heal. He'd merely nodded, but the next day, the swelling around Diablo's sore was visibly reduced. Their meals were eaten in the main cabin's kitchen, the silence punctuated only by the clink of cutlery against chipped plates. Elias wasn't a man for idle chatter, and Alara seemed content with the quiet. Yet in these shared silences, a fragile understanding began to form. He noticed the way she mended his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, the way she always saved a portion of her meager meal for the scrawny barn cat that had adopted the ranch. She, in turn, saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the way his gaze would sometimes drift to the empty rocking chair on the porch, a shadow of pain crossing his face. One sweltering afternoon, as Elias was hauling water from the nearly dry well, Jedediah Henderson rode up, his portly frame jiggling with self-importance. Henderson held the note on the bar M, and he rarely missed an opportunity to remind Elias of it. His gaze flickered dismissively towards Alara, who was diligently weeding the parched vegetable patch. "Thorn," Henderson boomed, his voice dripping with false bonhomie. "Still trying to make water from a stone, I see, and with unconventional help." He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Heard tell some folks think hiring certain individuals is like inviting trouble to sit at your table." Elias's hands tightened on the bucket rope. "She works hard, Henderson. Harder than some I've paid good money to." Henderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hard work don't fill a dry well, Thorn, or pay a bank note. Just a friendly reminder, the next payment's due sooner than you think. Wouldn't want to see Martha's place fall into less sentimental hands." He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture, and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. Alara continued her weeding, her back straight, but Elias saw the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for another stubborn root. That evening, the silence at supper was heavier, tinged with a shared anxiety. The well, their main source of water for the house and the small garden, was indeed failing. Each bucket Elias drew was shallower, muddier. He'd spent days trying to deepen it, working in the suffocating heat until his muscles screamed, but the water level remained stubbornly low. Despair was a familiar companion, but now it felt sharper, more urgent. One morning, Alara approached him as he stared disconsolately into the murky depths. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice hesitant, "down by the creek, where the willows grow thickest. The ground is damp there, even now. And the deer, they always graze near that spot." Elias looked at her, skepticism warring with a desperate need for any solution. The creek bed itself was mostly dry clay, baked hard by the sun. "That's just seepage, Alara, not enough to matter." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but my grandmother used to say, 'Where willow weeps, water sleeps.'" She knew how to find water. hidden springs. She taught me to look for certain plants, the way the land lies. She pointed towards a shallow depression further up the slope from the willows, an area he'd always considered barren rock. If we were to dig there, maybe. It was unconventional, based on old folk wisdom he'd always dismissed, but the image of Henderson's smug face, the thought of losing Martha's legacy, pushed him. "All right, Ilara," he said, the words feeling heavy with risk. "Show me." For days they dug, Elias with his brute strength, Ilara guiding him, her eyes scanning the soil, her hands sifting through the rock and clay. It was grueling, back-breaking work under a relentless sun. Just when Elias was about to give up, convinced it was another fool's errand, his shovel hit softer, damp earth. He dug faster, hope surging through him. And then a trickle, then a seep, then a small but steady gush of clear, cool water. It wasn't a torrent, but it was water. Enough to save the garden, enough for the house, enough to breathe a little easier. He looked at Ilara, her face smudged with dirt, her clothes damp with sweat, and for the first time he saw not the cursed woman, but a woman of quiet strength and unexpected knowledge. A small smile touched his lips. "Well, I'll be," was all he said, but the relief in his voice was profound. A few weeks later, sorting through a trunk of Martha's things he hadn't been able to face, Elias came across a small, intricately stitched sampler. "Home is where the heart is," it read, in faded blue thread. Ilara, who had come in to fetch a mending basket, saw it in his hands. Her own gaze softened. "It's beautiful work," she said quietly. Elias cleared his throat, the grief still a raw edge in his voice. Martha made it. She had a gift for making things beautiful. This place, it was her heart. Ilara reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers lightly tracing the embroidered letters. "She must have been a good woman." "The best," Elias said, his voice thick. He hadn't spoken of Martha to anyone in so long. But with Ilara, the words came, haltingly at first, then more easily, a sharing of sorrow that lessened its burden, just a little. He told her about Martha's laugh, her kindness, her unwavering belief in him and the ranch. Ilara listened, her quiet presence a comfort rather than an intrusion. In that shared moment of remembrance, another layer of the wall between them crumbled. He was beginning to see her not as an employee or a last resort, but as a companion in the quiet struggle of their days. The fragile peace, however, was short-lived. The sky, which had been stubbornly, cruelly blue for months, suddenly turned a bruised purple one afternoon. The air grew heavy, unnaturally still. Then, with a roar like a freight train, the hailstorm hit. Stones the size of pigeon eggs hammered the ranch, shredding the leaves from the cottonwoods, battering the roof of the cabin, and, most devastatingly, pounding the small field of corn Elias had painstakingly irrigated with water from their new, Ilara-found spring. He stood on the porch, watching helplessly as his hopes were literally beaten into the ground. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a landscape of ruin and a deafening silence. Elias walked out into the field, the ice crunching under his boots. The corn stalks were flattened, shredded, a total loss. It was the final blow, the banknote, the drought, and now this. He sank to his knees, the fight draining out of him. Ilara found him there, a solitary figure amidst the devastation. She didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. Instead, she knelt beside him, picking up a battered corn cob. "Some of the roots might still be good," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "And the lower stalks, the ones that were sheltered, we could salvage some for fodder. It's not a total loss, Mr. Thorne." She then gestured to a section of the field that lay slightly more protected by a small rise. And here the damage is less severe. With quick tending, some might recover. She spoke of fast-growing cover crops, of ways to protect the soil from washing away with the next rain. Her pragmatism, her refusal to surrender, was a stark contrast to his own despair. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a harbinger of bad luck, but a woman who had faced down misfortune so many times she knew its face and knew how to stare it back. A tiny ember of his own resilience flickered. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't over yet. The land was battered, but they were still standing. The hailstorm was a brutal setback, but Ilara's quiet resilience had shored up Elias's own. They salvaged what they could, their shared labor a silent testament to a growing partnership. However, the main threat to the Bar M wasn't the unpredictable weather, but the predictable greed of Jedediah Henderson. The payment on the banknote was looming, and Henderson, smelling blood in the water, made it clear he wouldn't grant an extension. He wanted the Bar M, not for its struggling fields, but for its water rights to the creek, rights that would become even more valuable if the drought continued, and he knew, as Elias did, that the new spring Ilara had found, while a godsend, wasn't enough to irrigate the entire ranch for cash crops. One morning, a rider brought a starkly worded letter from Henderson's bank. Pay in full within 2 weeks, or face foreclosure. Elias read it, his face grim. He had no way to raise that kind of money. His cattle were still too thin to fetch a good price, and the hail had wiped out any hope of a quick cash crop. He sat at the kitchen table, the letter clenched in his fist, the weight of impending failure crushing him, Martha's legacy slipping through his fingers. Ilara entered quietly, placing a cup of coffee before him. She saw the letter, the despair on his face. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "Mr. Thorne, there might be another way." He looked up, his eyes hollow. "There's no miracle coming, Ilara." "Perhaps not a miracle," she said, her gaze steady. "But there's knowledge. My grandmother, she wasn't just a water finder. She knew the old ways of the land, things people have forgotten. She used to talk about the starvation pasture." Elias frowned. "Starvation pasture? Never heard of it." "It's high up, in the broken lands towards the bluffs," Ilara explained, her voice low and earnest. "Most folks avoid it. They say it's bad land, cursed even. But grandmother said it holds water deep, and the grass is there. They're different, tougher. They cure well on the stalk, hold their nutrition even in drought. Cattle fatten quickly on them, if you know when to take them there, and how to manage them." She paused, then continued. "The stories say that a small herd, taken there near starvation, came back strong enough to survive the worst winters. That's why it got its name. It's a gamble, dangerous terrain. And if the stories are just stories." Elias stared at her. The broken lands. He knew the area she meant. It was treacherous, rocky, easily a place where cattle could be lost or injured. And the idea of relying on forgotten folklore, on something whispered down from a woman whose own granddaughter was deemed cursed, it went against every practical instinct he possessed. Yet, what were his alternatives? Surrender? Watch Henderson gloat as he took everything Martha had loved? "Why haven't you mentioned this before?" he asked, his voice still skeptical. A shadow crossed Ilara's face. "Because people fear what they don't understand, Mr. Thorne. My grandmother's knowledge, it was once respected, but times changed. People started calling her a witch, just as they call me cursed. To speak of such things, it only brings more trouble." She looked down at her hands, then met his gaze again, a quiet desperation in her eyes. "But your ranch, Martha's ranch, It's worth the risk of being called foolish, or worse. He saw it then, not just a desperate plan, but an offering. She was risking the fragile acceptance she'd found here, laying bare the very knowledge that had likely contributed to her family's ostracization, all to save his ranch. He thought of her quiet competence, the healed leg of his horse, the water she'd found when he'd given up hope. He thought of the way she tended Martha's struggling garden as if it were her own. The banknote, Henderson's sneering face, the ruined cornfield, all faded slightly before the intensity of her conviction. Elias rose from the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the parched land. For a long moment he was silent. Then he turned back to Alara. "This starvation pasture," he said, his voice raspy with a mixture of fear and a dawning, reckless hope. "How soon can we move the herd?" The decision hung in the air, a monumental gamble. Trusting Alara, trusting this whispered folklore, meant defying not only Henderson and the bank, but also the ingrained skepticism of a lifetime. It meant placing his entire future, Martha's legacy, into the hands of a woman deemed cursed, relying on knowledge that the rest of the world had dismissed as superstition. But in Alara's steady gaze, he saw not a curse, but a fierce, quiet intelligence, a deep connection to the land that he, for all his years of toil, had never possessed. He saw a strength forged in isolation and adversity. "We'll need to pack light, move fast," Ilara said, her voice gaining a new authority. "The trail is narrow, and there are sections where we'll have to lead them single file. We'll need every bit of daylight." Elias nodded, a sense of grim purpose settling over him. "I'll gather what supplies we can carry. You know the way?" "I walked it with my grandmother once, a long time ago," Alara confirmed. "I remember the landmarks. The twisted pine, the eagle's nest rock, the place where the creek disappears underground. The plan was audacious, almost foolhardy. To drive a weakened herd through treacherous, unfamiliar territory to a mythical pasture, all on the word of a woman whose own life was shrouded in ill omen. Yet, as they began their preparations, a strange sense of partnership solidified between them. Elias found himself deferring to Alara's judgment on what to pack, how to secure the gear. She, in turn, anticipated his needs, her movements efficient and sure. The looming threat of Henderson and the foreclosure acted as a forge, burning away the last vestiges of his doubt, her reserve. They were in this together, two solitary souls bound by a shared, desperate purpose. They left before dawn 2 days later, a small, stringy herd of cattle prodded reluctantly forward by Elias on Diablo and Alara on a steady, older mare Elias had kept for light work. The air was cool, the landscape stark under the pale morning sky. The first part of the journey was familiar, across the parched flats of the Bar M. But soon, Alara guided them towards the rising bluffs, into the broken lands he'd always avoided. The terrain grew rougher, the path narrower, littered with loose rock and thorny scrub. The cattle, already weak, balked frequently, their hooves slipping on the treacherous inclines. Elias's temper frayed, but Alara remained calm, her voice low and soothing as she coaxed the animals forward, her knowledge of their behavior uncanny. She pointed out hidden dangers, a loose rock face, a patch of poisonous locoweed, with an acuity that impressed him. Hours passed in grueling toil, the sun climbing higher, beating down mercilessly. Doubt gnawed at Elias. Was this a wild goose chase? Was he leading his herd, his last remaining assets, to their doom? As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the canyons, they reached a narrow pass. Alara reined in her mare. "This is it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The starvation pasture lies beyond this ridge." Elias looked ahead. The land seemed even more desolate, more forbidding than what they had traversed. He could see no sign of lush grass, no hint of water, just rocks and stunted, twisted trees. His heart sank. Had he made a catastrophic mistake? Just then, a horseman appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the dying sun. Jedediah Henderson. A cold smile spread across his face as he looked down at them, at the struggling herd. He was flanked by two hard-faced men Elias didn't recognize. "Well, well, Thorne," Henderson called out, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Taking your scrawny herd for a scenic tour? Or perhaps this woman has convinced you there's gold in these rocks?" He chuckled. "I admire your tenacity, Thorne, I truly do. But this is where it ends. My associates here will escort your cattle back. Sensible-like. They'll fetch a fair price at auction, enough to cover a portion of your debt. As for the land, well, consider it settled." Elias felt a cold rage rise within him. After all their effort, all their hope, to be thwarted here by this smug, greedy man. He looked at Elara. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with a defiant fire. "This land isn't yours to take, Henderson," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. He dismounted, placing himself between Henderson's men and the narrow pass. Henderson laughed. "Brave words, Thorne, but you're outnumbered, and that witch can't help you now." He gestured to Elara. "Everyone knows bad luck follows her. Looks like it finally caught up to you." It was then that Elara spoke, her voice clear and ringing in the still air, no longer hesitant but filled with a strength Elias had never heard before. "This pasture is not cursed, Mr. Henderson. It is blessed for those who know how to see, and you, sir, are blind." She urged her mare forward, past Elias, into the narrow defile. "The cattle will follow me. They know where the good grass is." To Elias's astonishment and Henderson's visible disbelief, the lead steer, a rangy old bull that had been nothing but trouble the entire journey, lifted its head, sniffed the air towards the pass, and then, with a low bellow, began to move forward, following Elara's mare. The rest of the herd, as if drawn by an invisible thread, followed suit. Henderson's face contorted with fury. "Stop them," he roared at his men. But before Henderson's men could react, Elias stepped forward, his hand resting on the worn stock of the Winchester rifle still in its saddle scabbard. His gaze was granite. "They're not your cattle to stop, Henderson. Not anymore. You've preyed on misfortune long enough. This is Bar M land, and these are Bar M cattle. And this woman," he nodded towards Elara, who was now disappearing with the herd into the pass. "She's the reason they'll survive, something you wouldn't understand." Henderson's men hesitated, looking from Elias's resolute stance to their employer's sputtering rage. There was a standoff, tense and brittle. Elias didn't flinch. He was no gunslinger, but there was a line, and Henderson had crossed it. The banker, seeing the unwavering determination in Elias's eyes, and perhaps realizing the questionable legality of seizing cattle on what was still, for a few more days, Thorne's land, finally seemed to deflate. He glared at Elias, his face mottled with anger. "You'll regret this, Thorne. You'll both regret this. You'll starve up here." He spat on the ground, then wheeled his horse around, his hired men following reluctantly. Their departure left a void, filled only by the sighing wind and the distant sound of cattle moving through the pass. Elias mounted Diablo and followed the herd. As he emerged from the narrow defile, the landscape opened up into a hidden valley he'd never known existed. And there, just as Elara had described, was grass. Not lush and green like a river bottom, but a hardy silver-green grass that grew in thick clumps, interspersed with hardy shrubs. A small, clear stream, fed by a spring hidden amongst a cluster of rocks, meandered through the valley floor. The cattle, weary from their journey, had already spread out, their heads down, grazing with a quiet intensity. Elara sat on her mare on a small rise, watching them, a faint, tired smile on her face. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the valley, painting it in hues of amber and rose. It was a place of stark, unexpected beauty, a sanctuary hidden from the harshness of the world below. Elias rode up beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke, simply absorbing the peace of the place, the quiet triumph. The threat of Henderson felt distant, almost unreal. "You knew," Elias said finally, his voice filled with awe. "You truly knew this place was here." Elara nodded. "My grandmother showed it to me. She said it was a place of resilience, a place where life holds on, even when everything else seems lost." Her gaze met his, clear and direct. "Like some people, Mr. Thorne." He understood. The curse, the whispers, the years of being an outcast. She was resilience personified. And in that moment, looking at her, at the saved herd, at this secret, life-giving valley, the last of his skepticism, the last of his grief-stricken inertia, vanished. He saw not just a hired hand, but a partner, a woman of extraordinary strength, wisdom, and courage. "Elara," he began, then hesitated, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you." She simply smiled, a genuine, open smile that transformed her face, wiping away the weariness. "We saved them together, Elias." His use of her first name, her use of his, it was a small thing, yet it marked a profound shift. The Bar M, Martha's legacy, had been pulled back from the brink, not by a miracle, but by forgotten knowledge, by courage, and by a trust forged in shared adversity. The land around them was no longer just a failing ranch. It was a place of possibility, of new beginnings. The days that followed in starvation pasture were filled with a quiet industry. The cattle, nourished by the rich, unexpected grasses, began to regain their strength, their hides growing sleek, their ribs less prominent. Elias and Elara worked side by side, mending the few dilapidated sections of an old drift fence that marked the valley's edge, clearing the spring, and simply watching over the herd. The harshness of the outside world, the judgment of Redemption Gulch, Jedediah Henderson's greed, it all seemed to belong to another life. Here, in this hidden sanctuary, there was only the land, the animals, and the shared purpose that bound them. The silence between them was no longer awkward or strained, but comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. They talked more easily now, sharing stories of their pasts, small dreams for the future. Elias spoke of Martha, not with the raw pain of before, but with a gentle remembrance that Elara received with quiet empathy. She, in turn, told him of her grandmother, of the lore of plants and water, of a childhood spent more in the company of nature than of people. He saw the deep well of kindness in her, the keen intellect, the resilience that had allowed her to survive so much scorn. The curse was never mentioned. It had become an irrelevance, a shadow dispelled by the light of her true character. When the time came for the banknote to be paid, Elias rode into Redemption Gulch not with a depleted herd, but with a small, carefully selected group of prime steers, fattened and strong from starvation pasture. He walked into Henderson's bank, laid the full amount on the counter, and met the banker's astonished, furious gaze with a cool, level stare. Word of his miraculously recovered herd had begun to filter through the town, carried by a bewildered Henderson and his men, who couldn't explain what they'd seen. Some still whispered of witchcraft, of Alara's curse somehow turning to good fortune for Thorn. But others, like old man Miller at the mercantile, who saw the quality of the steers Elias brought to market, began to look at the widower and his quiet companion with a new, grudging respect. The return to the Bar M was different. The ranch, though still bearing the scars of drought and neglect, no longer felt like a place of despair. With the immediate threat of foreclosure lifted, and with the knowledge of starvation pasture as a hidden reserve, hope had taken root. Ilara, no longer just a hired hand, moved with a quiet confidence. Her suggestions for improving the garden, for managing the remaining herd, now sought and valued by Elias. She had found her voice, her place, not as an outcast, but as an integral part of the ranch's survival and its future. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, Elias found Alara on the porch, mending one of his shirts. The needle flashed in the fading light, her movements sure and practiced. He sat beside her in Martha's old rocker, a comfortable silence settling between them. The air was cooler now, carrying the promise of autumn, and with it perhaps the overdue rains. He watched her, the gentle curve of her neck, the concentration in her eyes. He thought of the journey they had taken, the risks, the fear, the quiet triumph. He'd hired her out of desperation, a woman burdened by a cruel reputation. And she, in turn, had saved not just his ranch, but something within him too, something he thought had died with Martha. "The land feels different now," he said, his voice quiet, more alive. Ilara looked up, a soft smile touching her lips. "It's always been alive, Elias, just needed someone to listen to it." She paused, then added, "and someone to believe in what it could offer." He knew she wasn't just talking about the land. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers, stilling the needle. Her skin was warm, her fingers surprisingly strong. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze there was a depth of understanding, of gratitude, and of a burgeoning affection that needed no words. The Bar M Ranch, once a monument to loss, was now a testament to resilience, to the quiet courage of two souls who had found solace and strength in each other, against all odds. He watched her hum softly as she resumed her mending, the simple domestic sound filling the vast silence of the prairie, and he knew he'd hired more than a worker. He'd found the heart of his home again, beating strong and true beside his own. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.